Fearsome to the point of being foolhardy, Odogaron always seems ready for a fight. But why are they always getting into scrapes with other monsters? Do they deserve their reputation of aggression? And how do they survive in and out of their home, the Rotten Vale? Let's find out. One thing to start off with is the question of how Odogaron feeds as a scavenger, and I believe Odogaron to be a relatively rare class of animal known as a facultative predator. This group contains some birds like gulls, invertebrates, and most prevalently for us, the wolverine. Facultative predators are animals that prefer to scavenge, but can be capable hunters when the occasion calls for it. You may well be thinking, well, isn't that every carnivore? And yes, technically. But as we found out last week, being a scavenger has its own significantly different adaptive traits that differ to more purely predatory carnivores. It's already hard to be either class of carnivore, so to balance on the halfway point isn't really a picnic either. It's rare for an animal built primarily to scavenge to be able to swap back into hunting, and there's generally a broad spectrum of feeding styles that spans any carnivore guild. Wolverine's hunt-to-scavenge ratio depends on the condition of local prey and the prevalence of other predators in their environment. In summer, when there's plentiful young calves around, Wolverine will hunt them almost exclusively, whereas in the winter they tend to take any animal in poor condition. This is also when there will be the most animals in poor condition due to the harsh winter, and the most carrion too from natural mortality. So Wolverine also tend to scavenge a lot more in this time period as well. This can still vary on a lot of things though, and areas with large numbers of healthy reindeer and good numbers of Eurasian lynx show that even in summer Wolverine primarily scavenge, being less effective hunters of the fitter animals and then subsidised by the lynx kills. So Odogaron may be similar, a case of scavenging where there's plentiful carrion, and then swapping to making its own kills in cases where there isn't. But what adaptations does Odogaron have for this lifestyle, and how does he balance this with its morphology? One thing to note is that Odogaron seemingly can't supinate its forelimbs, which is to say have its palms facing upwards. It can manage a downwards smack, or a somewhat sideways swipe, but it can't rotate them fully. Extant canids as we know them today also can't properly supinate their forelimbs, an adaptation that allows for efficient long-distance movement at lower energetic cost, but with the trade-off of a reduction in dexterity. This is also shared by the Hyenidae, who also possess the inflexible forelimbs, but also even further adaptations that reduce flexibility. A shorter but stronger spinal column with less flexibility, and even stouter but less flexible limbs. These are adaptations to allow for the butchery and transportation of carrion. As said in Basil's video, scavengers have to monopolise ephemeral resources, and hyenas do so by tearing large pieces off carcasses and then transport them for miles at a time without stopping to cache them, often repeating this several times a day. So it's understandable that they have such massive forequarters due to this unique habit. Whilst most of the extant Hyenidae possess this, it's less pronounced in the predatory spotted hyena. While spotted hyenas have more robust limbs and skulls, they show some compromise in the hip breadth and lumbar spine to allow them to reach and maintain higher top speeds useful for hunting. In a similar way, Odogaron's body may well be a lattice of compromises made to try and both hunt and kill its cake and eat it. Odogaron is a strong monster, but it may have numerous compromises in dexterity to allow for efficient movement over long distances to find carrion. On an average night, brown hyenas can travel 30 kilometers in search of food, a pretty astonishing distance for the daily commute. Considering the much larger Odogaron will likely require much larger carcasses to satisfy it, its own travels may be even more extensive. This in turn may be why it developed its polydactyl feet. Most canids and hyenas can't retract their claws. They're used to give traction in movement and they're relatively blunt too. Odogaron may have its second row of claws so it can keep a set sharp for climbing, allowing it to scale rocky surfaces, drops or large trees with ease. These can also be useful for both fighting and attacking larger prey too. The grey fox has something similar. As well as some difference in forelimb dexterity to other canids, it also has semi-retractable claws that allow it to climb effectively by running up the tree or rock surface. As well as this, Odogaron may have increased mobility, but at the cost of lumbar robusticity, like spotted hyenas. Odogaron is undeniably a very fast and agile monster, and will transport small meals to certain points in its territory, but it will only drag large carcasses like fallen Legiana relatively short distances, so Odogaron may have to compromise on stability and ability to easily transport heavy loads in favour of extra speed and agility to benefit it in predation. If it were possible to dissect both ebony and regular Odogaron, there may be some differences further reflecting this. Similar to Anjanath, I believe ebony is actually the type species, and Odogaron derived from it to suit life in the Rotten Vale. Odogaron has less adaptations for either killing prey or displacing other predators like the loss of dragon element, but a vestigial form of this may still exist in Odogaron's enraged state, where it produces vapour from the mouth and some bioluminescence. This may actually be a very atrophied form or small amount of dragon element, just not enough to be properly weaponized like in ebony Odogaron, due to the fact Vale Odogaron no longer really need it. Vale Odogaron are for the most part pure scavengers, and much like brown hyenas, the bulk of their food is mainly carrion, with only occasional predation. But if life in the Vale is the scavenger Garden of Eden, why are Odogaron so aggressive to other scavengers and each other? Well, not all carrion is made equal. The fresher the body, the more water it still has, the more nutritious it is, and the more biomass there is to actually eat. Whilst we view scavengers as walking bin lorries consuming anything without concern, when given a choice they will be as picky as any other animal, and show preference for the freshest dead. So with this knowledge, some territories in the Vale may be a lot better than others. Ones near ceiling openings or the main chasm may be strongly preferred, due to the influx of fresh meat untainted by effluvium or other such crap in the Vale. Ones deeper in the Vale may have much more effluvium spoiling and eating the meat, the presence of Val presenting itself as a hostile foe, and other scavengers may also consume the meat too. So both food quality and quantity may be the causes of Odogaron's territoriality, and possibly even factor into their carrying capacity in the Vale. But Odogaron may have an instinctive trick or two up its sleeve to help make the good food last. We see that they will cache high quality kills. When adult Legiana expire in the Highlands and fall into the Vale, Odogaron is quick to take advantage and hide the kill in a ledge. This kill caching behaviour is quite common in the carnivores of our own world, but is almost unique to Odogaron in the world of Monster Hunter. So why may this be? The book oddly suggests that this is literally just Odogaron's personal taste, but the Vale is full of effluvium. This bacteria feeds on the carrion too to proliferate, but it can be reduced with fire and physical action, and seems to be present in a dense aerosol. So if you can find somewhere above the effluvium layer, you can try to avoid its effects. Leopards are also well known for caching their kills in trees, and research shows that this isn't an innate behaviour, but a response to kleptoparasite presence, primarily spotted hyenas. Odogaron's kleptoparasite may not be another vertebrate, but the dense clouds of effluvium, prompting it to cache fresh carrion as quickly as possible, and in high locations to avoid effluvium infestation. The World Book also notes that Odogaron's larder is in an area of little effluvium after all. Much like Diablos and the tiny ants in the Wildspire, Odogaron's fiercest competition in the Vale may be bacteria over another monster. Another factor may be its small size. Carnivores that don't cache the kills may instead just guard them, sleeping by the carcass until it's finished. This is all very well and good if you're large enough, but Odogaron isn't really. Outside of the Vale, ebony Odogaron can be seen transporting pieces of its kills with it. Guarding its food may be too risky for it to do, so it caches it to protect it from theft. This may also be why caching is so rare in Monster Hunter. Giants like Deviljho, Tigrex and Glavenus may just guard their kills until they're completely consumed. Rathalos and other predatory wyverns may just eat a single meal from each kill as many raptors do. Others like Garuga may be small prey specialists, so there's nothing really to cache after foraging. Odogaron is really the only macro predator despite its small size. So again, like the Wolverine, Odogaron may cache its kills for both the refrigeration hypothesis of preserving food, and the habitat structure hypothesis of keeping it safe from thieves. Outside of the Vale, Ebony isn't the type to pass up a free meal, but it may primarily be a hunter. In Basil's video, we assess the potential habitats in terms of their carrion productivity, but that may not really benefit Ebony. Basiljuice's movement and carcass locating is so swift and efficient, it likely completely outstrips Ebony in this regard. It may well be the major factor both in individual and evolutionary terms for Ebony being a relatively predatory animal. Basiljuice may just be too good at its job for Ebony Odogaron to be anything more than a facultative scavenger. And like with Wolverines, we can try and suggest ratios of hunting to scavenging for the various biomes Ebony finds itself in, but for most of them its diet will likely be dominated by either its own kills or freshly stolen ones over older carrion. The exception to this may be the Hoarfrost. Ebony Odogaron may not look built for the cold. But as said in Anjanath's video, he's large enough that he doesn't really have to be. Considering it's always producing dragon energy and it always seems hungry, it also seems like Ebony Odogaron may warm itself via naturally high rates of energy expenditure in exceptionally frigid conditions. Cold climates provide regular mortality of animals due to the harsh conditions, and the Hoarfrost also doesn't lack for predators that leave good carcasses with reasonable amounts to eat on them, like Legiana and Barioth. The Hoarfrost may provide at least a seasonal refuge for Ebony Odogaron to be a scavenger as well as a predator. The ability to modify metabolic rates isn't unheard of in scavengers, as discussed last time with vultures, and this seems to be the most reasonable explanation for the charged state Odogaron can enter. This occurs just after eating, and it may be possible Odogaron changes its energy expenditure depending on food availability and circumstance. Metabolic switching isn't unheard of, and normally ectothermic tegus can become functionally endothermic under the right circumstances, although typically believed to be related to reproduction. Odogaron's charged state after eating may be to help it make the most of a temporary resource, allowing it to consume as much as it can, but also to allow for high activity rates to cache as much food as possible for later, or to defend the kill from other scavengers. As when scavenging, you don't often have the luxury of the carcass to yourself, and without the size and exploding scales of Basiljuice, Odogaron may occasionally be in trouble here. With turf wars, we now have more instances of aggressive and/or competitive interactions between monsters than ever before, and Odogaron is effectively Mr. Turf War, with 7 unique animations for it, 1 shared one and 1 cutscene all detailing his aggressive interactions with other monsters. Whilst Odogaron does very well in some of these, in some others the same can't be said, and whilst it technically draws against larger wyverns like Glavenus or Tigrex, it seems pretty clear that it's the less powerful animal, and relies mainly on speed to dodge hits, whilst its own attacks do relatively little damage. In some cases, like against the enormous Devil Joe, it seems its goose may well be cooked. And whilst Odogaron is often said to suffer from short-man syndrome, size is very important in competitive interactions, and is the simplest explanation for why Odogaron gets tossed around quite so much. Despite the screechings of assorted people on the internet, it isn't sharper teeth or claws or coolness that's the most important factor in a fight. Size is the single most important variable in who kills who. Not only this, but it also changes the nature, frequency, and intensity of interactions between predators, as to whether they're predatory or competitive, lethal or non-lethal. In mammalian carnivores, predators killing much smaller predators are likely just instances of opportunistic predation, where they killed for food primarily in the moment. The larger another carnivore gets in comparison to your own size, the more likely you are to kill them out of competition, because it becomes more and more likely that with size they'll be taking the same resources as you. So Tigrex, at roughly 2 or 3 times the size of Odogaron, likely attacks it as it shares its resources, like a lion with a hyena or a leopard. Devil Joe, at least 8 or 9 times the mass of Odogaron, likely attacks it as opportunistic and attempted predation, like a lion with a jackal or a wildcat. After all, it is mentioned that Deviljho's monster-carrying behaviour is it hanging on to something it perceives as a meal. This also goes some way to explain the presence of animals similar to those from our own world in the world of Monster Hunter. Lions and tigers are often referenced in-game, and palamutes must have a wild ancestor, perhaps the wolves howling in the Arctic Ridge. People have expressed skepticism over such animals existing in the Monster Hunter world with such powerful competition. But really it's not Rathalos or Deviljho or Tigrex they'd have to worry about. Mammalian carnivores would likely eat things like kelbie or mosswine primarily. Some dietary analysis of Pleistocene lions shows in some areas their diet was mainly reindeer, a far smaller staple than the large game of today's African lions. So there would be little competition between our predators and the large wyverns, who probably wouldn't even bother to attack them outside of an occasional opportunistic attempt at predation. Most competition would come from smaller bird wyverns, and even then their keystone individuals would likely reduce competition with animals like lions and wolves by selecting for the larger prey items bigger wyverns also prefer. It could be possible that this, as well as their high turnover rates, could weaken the competitive impact of bird wyverns too. In the New World it seems like they were forced into solitary specialist niches by the presence of fanged wyverns, and there is seemingly little reference or presence of mammals like wolves or lions in the New World too. Maybe fanged wyverns were the superior competitors in that regard. But what about something the same size as you? Killings get considerably rarer at this size level, as attacking someone you don't have a weight advantage over is risky. So in turf wars between various monsters, it does make sense that for the most part the larger monsters beat smaller ones, and monsters of roughly equal mass still fight frequently but typically don't kill each other, despite the fact that they'll likely be using the same resources. For most similar-sized carnivores, a flat-out fight to the death is just too risky despite how much you share, and how frequently you may have less serious fights too. This isn't to say it doesn't and can't happen, but it's not likely to be common, and the killer species will likely have an advantage over the other in some way. A size advantage, even if less than 100%, is still a big advantage, or their opponent may be compromised in some way, as carnivore interactions can be pretty complex. For example, bobcats can effectively defend their kills from larger coyotes with greater frequency than you'd expect for their smaller size. But when push comes to shove, single-handedly or in packs, coyotes will occasionally kill all sex and age classes of bobcats. Similarly, brown bears have great success in displacing wolves from their hard-won kills, possibly gaining a large amount of their nutrition this way, and winning almost every interaction over a carcass. Some wolf packs lose almost every kill to bears. But when it comes to young, wolves defend their dens and pups much more savagely, winning almost every interaction regarding offspring defense, and occasionally killing bear cubs and sometimes even adults. Other bears, like sloth bears, can be predated by larger felids like tigers, with some males even possibly becoming sloth bear specialists. But tigers usually hunt via stealth, and in a frontal confrontation when they can't use a surprise attack, tigers rarely succeed, and often flee instead, with sloth bears aggressively displacing them. Lions and hyenas have an algorithm of the numbers, ages and sexes of the participants in competitive interactions to determine who wins. So overall, aggressive interactions between predators are clearly complex behaviours that are dependent on species, age, sex, condition, circumstance, personal experience, hunger, and a myriad of other factors that determine the outcome, like whether two predators ignore each other in relative harmony or fight to the death. Trying to place a definitive winner or the superior animal in a lot of such interactions often ignores all of this in favour of discussion, typically of immeasurable or nonsensical behaviours or traits, like fighting ability or bloodlust, and is best left to school playgrounds. If animals like honey badgers or monsters like Odogaron seem anomalous in this regard, this is more due to ignorance, cherry-picked sightings, and poor readings of animal behaviour. What are often believed or claimed to be dramatic instances of honey badgers showing groups of lions who the boss is actually a desperate honey badger fighting for its life against a curious group of lion cubs. David versus Goliath stories go viral because they're unexpected, and give the false impression this is a usual encounter. The norm is that honey badgers are typically killed and sometimes eaten by larger predators, and try to avoid encounters with them at all costs. If the world of Monster Hunter had such safaris, it would probably be the same, with Odogaron believed to be the amazing, fearless Napoleon of the animal kingdom, when really a lot of its interactions with larger predatory monsters are it getting badly mauled by them. Odogaron does as well as it can, but if your opponent can keep you pinned under one hand, you're just not physical equals. Whilst it may give a good showing and its ferocity and weaponry are enough to minimise predation, it almost certainly meets its death occasionally in the teeth and claws of larger wyverns. Odogaron's actual reason for fighting may be the same as honey badgers, in that they view this as their last resort. Odogaron has canonically poor senses. It apparently has very poor vision, and whilst maybe not as bad as the book suggests, it likely relies on smell much more than sight. Whilst feeding or foraging, this may be insufficient to warn it of other monsters until it's often too late, and so they feel cornered and go on the offensive to try and repel the threat with varying success, much like honey badgers who also have poor eyesight and are relatively easy to sneak up on. Animals like them don't go looking for trouble, they often just don't have any other final option other than fighting. In the case of Val Hazak especially, the fact it's coated in both rotten meat and effluvium may effectively mean it's invisible to Odogaron until it's right on top of it. It's saturated in the two smells that are everywhere in the Vale. When confronted suddenly by Val, Odogaron panics and goes on the attack, only to be knocked out by the Elder Dragon. Radobarn, on the other hand, seems something of an anomaly, and despite outweighing Odogaron considerably, it is solidly trounced by it. This may come from the adaptations the Hammerjaw wyverns have that led them away from predation. Carnivoran mammals, even herbivorous ones like giant pandas, still retain many physical adaptations for predation, despite their diet and effectiveness as predators. In contrast, wyverns like Uragan and Radobarn have completely moved away from this. Despite retaining the theropod boar plan of the brute wyverns, their teeth and claws are now completely non-functional for predation. Just about everything faces some competition in its niche, sometimes even physically from opponents. But these animals rarely actually kill each other due to the lack of innate drive and weaponry to do so. Competition between mammalian carnivores is so intense and dangerous, due to their evolutionary adaptations as predators, meaning it's in their nature to actually engage in killing. Radobarn's adaptations have ultimately robbed it of the significance of its size advantage in competition with Odogaron, and it seems this may be the case for the Hammerjaw wyverns in general, as they seem to fare pretty poorly in interspecific interactions. But with the how of Odogaron's turf wars looked at, what about the why? Why exactly is he Mr. Turf War? This is likely due to his scavenging habits and the risks Odogaron as a species may be willing to take. Some scavengers can have complex relationships with the predators they often steal from, and take great risks in doing so. Odogaron's scavenging diet and overconfidence may naturally predispose him to violent encounters with other larger wyverns that can sometimes be fatal, which is seemingly a risk worth taking for the food. Wolverines across much of their range will readily scavenge wolf kills, to the point of it making significant changes to their diet when wolves recolonize areas. The large prey wolves provide, like elk and reindeer carcasses, subsidize wolverines, and provides them with a fairly regular source of food. The issue comes in that visiting wolf kills is risky to say the least, and the most important form of natural mortality for wolverines is often wolves. If wolverines get caught by the rightful owners of the kill, it often ends in their doom, or at very least them getting chased off. Odogaron's scavenging behaviour may well be why he is so frequently in conflict with larger wyverns. He's frequently attracted to their kills with violent results for him. Even if Odogaron isn't quite the pint-sized psycho some like to imagine him as, he still takes some pretty nutty risks in acquiring his daily bread that it regularly risks its life to do so. Tigrex may especially stand out here in the Hoarfrost too. As said, there may be reasonably good amounts of biomass left on both Barioth and Legiana kills. With its bone-crushing jaws, big appetite and likely good sense of smell, Tigrex is probably a successful scavenger and kleptoparasite too when the occasion calls for it. It may be Ebony Odogaron's most significant competitor in the Hoarfrost, both as a co-predator and when meeting at kills appropriated from other wyverns. Sometimes you don't scavenge passively though, and actively steal kills in a behaviour known as Kleptoparasitism. This is effectively stealing someone else's food straight from them, and is very common among predators. As you'd expect, it's often employed by successful scavengers too, and has its own subset of traits that make a successful kleptoparasite. In short, a good sense of smell, the ability to efficiently cover long distances, and the brawn to push others off their kills are the prerequisites needed. Bears and canids are very effective at this in our own world, and in Monster Hunter certain brute wyverns may be very effective kleptoparasites, along with Basiljuice and Tigrex too. Ebony Odogaron is somewhat limited in its small size here, as well as the foraging behaviour of other monsters limiting the amount it can steal, but it may still be an effective kleptoparasite of some species. Unable or unwilling to cache kills, Nagakuga may especially be a frequent victim of other monsters, but especially Ebony Odogaron when the two overlap in the Coral Highlands or Ancient Forest. Not quite as large and brawny as Tigrex, Nagakuga may not have the sheer might to so easily dispel the Fanged Wyvern. The two may have a similar relationship to leopards and hyenas, with Odogaron's excellent smell and swift traversing making it the keenest thief of Nagakuga, just as spotted hyenas are out of the guild of predators leopards share the savannas with. Nagakuga's slight size advantage may also not be enough to dispel competitors too, as smaller brown and striped hyenas will also readily steal from leopards, and even attack even when food isn't present, much as Ebony Odogaron may sometimes do upon seeing other certain predators. Not all conflicts are directly competitive in nature though, and much like his comparison for much of this video, Odogaron likely engages in intra-guild predation. His turf wars with Sitsuyaku and Palumu are likely its own opportunistic attempts at capturing novel prey items in a carrion-poor environment. And this isn't uncommon in some carnivores. Wolverines themselves will eat just about anything, and will occasionally consume smaller carnivores, even predating and eating both Canadian and Eurasian flavours of lynx. Fishers are a lesser known but no less fierce mustelid, and in periods of normal prey like snowshoe hares falling in numbers, will also take to killing Canadian lynx as food. A pretty surprising finding considering lynx are typically larger than fishers, and even adult males in good condition are killed. And this may be why Odogaron steamrolls most of the Coral Highlands roster. It's said Odogaron may leave the Vale occasionally to try and find new foraging patches, but individuals that climb up the side find themselves going from a banquet to an empty table, with little carrion and very few large terrestrial animals. If they don't head back down to find more food, they may begin to predate other monsters due to the relatively inaccessible biomass in the Highlands for a large carnivore like Odogaron. This may also explain why the already aggressive Odogaron so readily flies into combat with each other in the Coral Highlands too. Competition for what little food there is here may just be that much more intense. Legiana likely contests Odogaron as classic interference competition. Odogaron enters Legiana's territory and starts eating Legiana's food, so it attacks to drive it away. Whilst physically a match for Legiana, Odogaron may be vulnerable to aerial assaults, especially on the cliffs and towers of the Highlands where Odogaron's poor eyesight may prevent it from detecting its opponent in time, before it gets smacked back down into the Vale where it belongs. This trilogy of videos in particular has been very carnivore focused, as well as looking into aspects of competition and foraging behaviour. Hopefully it can go some way into showing that scavenging is very much its own behaviour, with its own classes of unique organisms. So often documentaries seem to portray it as failure. If you can't hunt, you scavenge. But really it's a completely different set of challenges and a unique and difficult lifestyle. Any talk of competition between animals can be pretty risky business on the internet, and before anyone tries to comment claiming honey badgers or wolverines actually kill entire packs of wolves or lion prides, note that any such footage coming from a 30-year-old documentary with about 15 different close-up angles of elusive and shy animals is almost certainly staged, and in some cases you can even see the handlers in the background too. Similarly, any video with these sorts of descriptors in the title probably doesn't have a fat lot of educational value, and is likely made by some spazzo trying to win an argument online. So to start with my thoughts on Odogaron, I love it. Unlike a lot of other monsters where they grew on me over time, it was very much love at first sight, and Odogaron is my personal best newcomer in world, as well as one of my favourite monsters. There isn't really much to say other than it delivers excellently on just about all aspects you would want it to. Design, fight, personality, turf wars, sounds. It really is a condensation of the best aspects world had to offer. As a rule, I generally don't like non-elemental monsters getting elemental subspecies, but Ebony is the exception that proves the rule. I feel the bizarre, edgy reputation of dragon element fits Odogaron's vibe. And the whole thing with his rage state somewhat appearing similar to dragon, I also think meshes quite well with my theory of his atavism. Overall, a top monster I hope we'll continue to see in the future, although hopefully still in the new world and not explicably in the old one without a good reason. Ebony also provides me with a segue into the tangentially relevant discussion point for the end of the episode that is subspecies, roster bloat, invaders and their effects in game. One thing writing the script for these videos really came to make me realise was what a tight, focused experience Base World was. Everything was very deliberate and well thought out in regards to monsters and ecosystems and where they belonged and who they interacted with just a lot of love and care put into it. And Iceborne wasn't really on the same page with all that. Now don't get me wrong, it was a great add-on. The worldified versions of past Apexes were great, the new monsters were decent, and the subspecies and variants the best we've ever gotten. Not that there was much competition. But still, the Hoarfrost is also a fantastic map, Celiana was nice, and so on. But the roster and its placement swiftly became something of a mess. Rise does have a shameful amount of copy and pasted turf wars, but Iceborne really has its fair share too between the monsters of the same skeleton. And I feel this stems from the issue of just letting monsters wander around everywhere. I firmly believe Banbaro and Fulgur Anjanath have no business as invaders, and should be Hoarfrost exclusives only. I'm not 100% sure where Rajang should live, but I also feel a delicate primate should not just be everywhere. With their subspecies too, Glavenus and Tigrex are in a lot more maps than it feels they should be. I think 4U started this trend due to having very weird non-specific maps. As well as jungle, snow and desert, the Sunken Hollow was just a weird mineshaft that everyone lived in, as was the Ancestral Steppe that wasn't really a steppe. As well as being the root of a lot of unnecessary copy and pasted turf wars, I also feel this is what makes a roster feel bloated very quickly, constantly having all the monsters chaotically thrown at you. And some maps really suffered. As I've said before, the Forest and Wildspire feel like very well constructed maps with the monster choice and interactions. I've seen some say the rest was forgotten in comparison, and I don't really think that's fair. The Coral Highlands and the Rotten Vale are one big ecosystem locked into each other, with Odogaron being top dog of the Vale until Val, and then also assaulting most of the Coral Highlands who aren't used to a novel predator. Legiana still bullies Palumu, but the Highlands did feel a bit sparse, and this meant they really suffered in Iceborne when they got a ton of large carnivores inexplicably dumped in them. The franchise has always had a bit of a problem with holding off volcano maps, and it feels very prevalent in Base World too with the new Ecology focus. If you have them fully fleshed out as an ecosystem, you have to visit them early on. If you save it for later, you'll just have all the lower tiers feel pointless. But if you don't do this, you'll wind up with the Elder's Recess, a map without much personality that just has a random collection of ore eaters and elders in it with little interaction. Which is a shame, as aesthetically I feel it's the best volcano map by far. For the overall issue, I feel being a lot more strict with where monsters can and can't live would do a lot of good here. I'm not saying have monsters live in only one locale, but actually give them a set of habitat preferences and stick to them. Tigrex seems to have been intended as an open country wyvern, not necessarily bothered by temperature, but preferring sparse terrain like mountain, deserts and steppes. So he can be in multiple maps, but taking him out of the ancient forest and volcano means he isn't everywhere and doesn't have to copy and paste Naga's turf war with Rathalos. Some species can also be a lot more or less strict than others too. I do like how the Bloss Wyverns have never left the desert, but I also think smaller, lower level generalist monsters can survive in a lot of places. I also think a refined version of the season mechanic from DOS would do a lot of good here. Having some areas off limits for a season, and having some monsters absent or move to new biomes for a season as they hibernate or migrate or any other reason, as well as having maps partially change in things like weather and vegetation for the season too. On top of this, the day and night mechanic could actually mean something, and it'd be great if it affected monster behaviour, for example with Rathalos sleeping at night and Nagakuga and Anjanath being most active at night. In short, I actually think sitting down to think about monster behaviour would really do a lot of good to reduce the messy chaos large rosters can bring. I think someday a lot of this may come to fruition, especially with an open world game, which is where I think the series is heading. Probably not Monster Hunter 6, but maybe Monster Hunter 7. So set your watches for 2027 to see if I called it or not. Thanks for watching. And thanks to Glide Borealis for once again allowing me to use his documentary quality footage of monsters. Go and check him out if you haven't already. Thanks also to Dapper Raptor for collecting just about all of the turf wars from Worldborn for this video too. And thanks to all of you for your continuing support and positivity with these videos. Hopefully I did Odo justice here, and of course the reminder that my videos aren't canon. So if you prefer Odo as more of a psycho, then that's fine. And probably more of what Capcom wanted anyway. This was an attempt to try and use the behaviour of animals typically believed to be psychos themselves, to try and explain Odo's own behaviour. To address a comment or two, Raptor X863 pointed out that with visual acuity, it's often based on the absolute size of the eye rather than relative in terms of body mass. So Basiljuice likely has truly exceptional vision like a lot of the roster. And off the top of my head, Pukey may have some of the most impressive sight of any Wyvern. For some of the more general comments, whilst I've said I wouldn't mind for some of the elders to be knocked down a peg or turf warring with Wyverns and other monsters, it's more that I wish Capcom would be consistent with monster power and who gets to fight them, rather than just picking favourites to become superpowered, as there's a lot of giant apex wyverns that feel incredibly underpowered compared to fan favourite Mary Sue's despite their size and canonical abilities. I wouldn't say I dislike Rajang, but I think he's been overhyped for sure, as Capcom know it's a fan favourite that led to it being promoted to Elder Wrestler. When I referred to it as delicate earlier, I more refer to how primates have comparatively narrow ranges. So to move things along, next video will be a bit longer and will be out whenever it's out. And here's the pretty obvious spoiler for it.